Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where survival wasn't a choice. It was the only option. The year is 1880. The place is De Smet, Dakota Territory. And on the Prairie, 7 months from anywhere that matters, a merchant is about to face a decision that will determine who lives and who doesn't. You're standing on Main Street in De Smet. It's not much of a street. Dirt, wagon ruts, and buildings so new the lumber still smells like sawdust. The town is barely a year old. 20 families, maybe 30. You can count every person by name, and every single one of them depends on one thing, the train. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway brought you here. It brought the lumber for your house, the flour in your barrel, the kerosene in your lamp, the nails holding your roof together. Without that train, you're living in the middle of an ocean of grass with nothing but what you carried in your wagon. And winter is coming. Daniel Loftus knows this better than anyone. He's the merchant. His store sits on Calumet Avenue, a wood frame building with a false front that makes it look bigger than it is. Inside, shelves line the walls, flour barrels, sugar sacks, bolts of fabric, kerosene cans, salt pork in brine, everything a Prairie family needs to make it through until spring. Loftus bought it all on credit from wholesalers in Chicago. He shipped it here by rail, and now he's selling it at a markup that keeps him fed and his creditors happy. But there's something in the air this October, something wrong. The muskrats are building their dens thicker this year. You've noticed it. Everyone has. The walls of mud and cattail reeds along Silver Lake are twice as tall as last year, twice as thick. Animals know things people don't. They read the sky, the wind, the way the geese fly south, and the muskrats are saying, "Prepare." An old man came through town last week. Native, Dakota or Lakota, you're not sure. He didn't stay long, just stopped at the general store, looked at the sky, and said to anyone who would listen, 7-month winter. Big snow. No trains. Most people laughed. 7 months? Impossible. Winters here are hard, sure, but 7 months? That's exaggeration. That's old man doomsaying. The railroad is modern, it's progress. It doesn't stop for snow. But Charles Ingalls didn't laugh. Pa, they call him. He's got a wife and 4 daughters, and he's been on this frontier long enough to trust his gut more than his optimism. When he heard that warning, he moved his family off their homestead claim and into town, rented a building on Main Street, got his girls closer to the store, closer to other people, closer to whatever help might exist when things go wrong. And on October 15th, 1880, things go very, very wrong. The blizzard comes out of nowhere. You're outside hanging laundry or chopping wood or checking on your animals, and the temperature drops 40 degrees in 2 hours. The sky turns grey, then white, then disappears entirely. Snow doesn't fall, it attacks, horizontal, blinding. The wind screams like something alive and angry, tearing at your clothes, stealing the breath from your lungs. You stumble back to your house. You can't see 3 feet in front of your face. The world has vanished. There's only white and cold and wind. You make it inside, slam the door, and realise if you'd been any farther from home, you'd be dead right now. The blizzard lasts 3 days. When it finally stops, the prairie is unrecognisable. Snowdrifts 20 feet high. Roads gone, fences buried. The train tracks. You can't even see them. And the train that was supposed to arrive last week, it never came. People gather at Loftus's store, not to buy, to talk, to figure out what happens next. Loftus is there, standing behind his counter, arms crossed, face unreadable. He's doing math in his head. Inventory, demand, time. He's got flour, maybe 3 barrels, sugar, a little, salt pork. Enough for a month if people are careful. But here's the problem. No one knows when the next train is coming. Could be a week, could be 2. The railroad company will send ploughs. They'll clear the tracks. They always do. Except this time, they don't. November comes. Another blizzard. Then another. The train tries. You hear about it later. Crews from the east pushing ploughs through drifts that fill in behind them as fast as they clear. Locomotives straining, then stopping, then turning back. By December, the railroad gives up. Too expensive, too dangerous, too impossible. They'll try again in spring. And De Smet is alone. You're standing in Loftus's store in late December, and the shelves are starting to look empty. The flour barrels have maybe 20 pounds left between them. The sugar's gone, the kerosene's gone. The salt pork is down to the last few pieces floating in brine that smells more like desperation than preservation. Loftus sees you looking. He knows what you're thinking. He's thinking it too. Because here's the truth neither of you wants to say out loud. If that train doesn't come soon, people are going to starve. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing he can do to stop it. You wake up on a January morning and the first thing you do is check the window. Not to see if it's snowing. It's always snowing. But to see if you can still see out. Because some mornings the snow has drifted so high against the house that the windows are buried. Some mornings, you open the door and there's a wall of white where the porch used to be. Some mornings, you wonder if you'll ever see the sun again. It's been 3 months since the last train. 3 months of blizzards that come every few days like clockwork. 3 months of temperatures so cold that water freezes solid in the bucket overnight. 3 months of burning twisted hay for heat because the coal ran out in November and the wood pile ran out in December. Your hands are raw from twisting hay into tight sticks that burn fast and smell like farm animals and desperation. And the food is almost gone. Not just at your house. Everywhere. Every family in De Smet is down to the same grim inventory. A little flour if you're lucky. Potatoes if you were smart enough to store them in the cellar. Maybe some dried beans, maybe some cornmeal, nothing fresh, nothing green, nothing that doesn't taste like dust and survival. Carolyn Ingalls is grinding wheat in a coffee mill, not flour, wheat, whole kernels, because there's no flour left to buy, and the wheat is all that's keeping her family alive. She pours a handful of kernels into the top of the mill, turns the crank, and after 20 minutes of grinding she has maybe a cup of coarse brown flour. It takes 4 hours to grind enough for 1 loaf of bread, 4 hours of turning that crank until her arm aches and her wrist feels like it might snap. And the bread she makes from it? It's brown, dense, gritty. It tastes like sadness and hard work, but it fills your stomach, and right now, that's all that matters. At Loftus's store, the shelves are empty. Not low, empty. The flour barrels sit on their sides, lids off, showing nothing but a dusting of white at the bottom. The sugar barrel is gone, the salt pork is gone, the kerosene is gone. The dried apples, the beans, the coffee, the tea, all of it, gone. Loftus stands behind his counter staring at those empty barrels like they've personally betrayed him. Because in a way they have. He's a merchant. His job is to have things, to sell things, to keep the money moving and the shelves stocked and the customers happy. But you can't sell what you don't have. And you can't order more when the trains aren't running. He's done the math. He knows how much food is left in this town, he knows how many people need to eat, and he knows the numbers don't add up, not even close. If nothing changes, if no train comes, if no one finds food somewhere, people will start dying by March, maybe sooner, maybe a lot sooner. But here's the thing about frontier towns, they don't just roll over and die, not without a fight. Rumours start to spread. A farmer 12 miles south of town, or maybe it's 20 miles, depending on who's telling the story, has seed wheat. 60 bushels of it. He was saving it for spring planting, but spring is a long way off. And right now, that wheat could save lives. The problem is getting to it. 12 miles doesn't sound like much, but 12 miles in a Dakota blizzard? That's a death sentence. The wind erases roads. The cold kills exposed skin in minutes. If you get turned around, if you lose your way, if your horse gives out, you're done. Frozen solid before anyone even knows you're missing. But 2 young men decide to try anyway. Almanzo Wilder and Cap Garland. Almanzo is 25. Cap is younger. They're both strong, both experienced with horses, both just foolish enough to think they can make it. They wait for a break in the weather, a day when the wind dies down and the snow stops falling, and they ride south. The whole town watches them go. No one says it out loud, but everyone is thinking the same thing. We might never see them again. They're gone for 2 days, 2 days of silence, 2 days of waiting and wondering and praying, And then, on the third day, they come back, alive, half frozen, but alive. And behind them, on a sled, are 60 bushels of wheat. The town erupts. People pour out of their houses, shouting, crying, thanking God and Almanzo and Cap and anyone else who might be listening. 60 bushels. That's enough to keep everyone alive for weeks, maybe months if they're careful. It's not salvation, but it's hope. And on the prairie in the winter of 1881, hope is the most valuable thing you can buy. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because that wheat doesn't belong to the town. It belongs to the farmer who sold it. And now someone has to decide who gets it. How much does it cost? And who's going to control the only food source left in a town full of starving people? The answer, of course, is Daniel Loftus. Because he's the merchant. He's the one with the scales and the cash box and the storefront. He's the one who knows how to turn wheat into money. And he's about to make a decision that will define him for the rest of his life. You're standing in Loftus's store when the wheat arrives. The whole town is here. Every man, woman and child who can walk has crowded into this one small building, pressing against the walls, craning their necks to see the sacks of wheat being unloaded from the sled. 60 bushels. It doesn't look like much, just burlap sacks stacked in the corner. But to you it looks like life. It looks like your children's faces with colour in their cheeks, instead of that grey, sunken look they've had for weeks. It looks like bread. Real bread. Not the gritty brown stuff Caroline Ingalls grinds out of desperation, but actual wheat bread that rises and smells like something worth living for. Loftus looks at those sacks, and you can see the wheels turning in his head. He paid for that wheat, fronted the money to Almanzo and Cap, sent them south with cash and hope, and the understanding that if they came back, he'd be the one selling what they brought. That's how it works. That's business. He took the risk. He gets the profit. But here's the question no one wants to ask out loud. How much profit? The room is quiet. People are waiting. Watching. Loftus clears his throat. He's not a tall man. Not particularly imposing. But right now, standing behind that counter with 60 bushels of wheat at his back, he's the most powerful person in De Smet. He knows it. You know it. Everyone in this room knows it. He names his price. $5 per bushel. The room goes silent. Not the good kind of silent. The cold, shocked, disbelieving kind of silent. $5 per bushel? That's outrageous. That's robbery. Before the train stopped, wheat cost $1 a bushel. Maybe $1.50 if the market was tight. $5 isn't a price. It's extortion. But what are you going to do? Not buy it. Your family is starving. Your children are hungry. You've been eating potatoes and nothing else for 6 weeks. And even the potatoes are running out. If you don't buy that wheat, you might not make it to spring. And Loftus knows it. Someone speaks up. You don't see who. But the voice is steady and firm and carries the weight of a man who's seen hard times and survived them. It's Charles Ingalls, Pa. He says, "Mr. Loftus, that wheat is yours to sell. This is a free country, and every man has a right to charge what he wants for his property. No one here is going to tell you otherwise." Loftus relaxes. Just a little. Because Pa Ingalls is respected. If he's siding with the merchant, then maybe this won't turn ugly. But Pa's not finished. He says, "But I'll tell you something else, Mr. Loftus. Along about next summer, you're going to notice that your business isn't what it used to be. People are going to remember this winter. They're going to remember what you charged when they were starving. And they're going to take their business elsewhere. Maybe to Hawthorne's store. Maybe to someone new who sets up shop, but they won't be coming here. Not after this." The room is silent again. But this time, it's a different kind of silent. This time, people are nodding, murmuring agreement. Because Pa Ingalls just said what everyone was thinking, but no one had the courage to say, "You can charge whatever you want, but there's a price for greed, and it's not paid in dollars." Loftus's face changes. You see it happen. The confidence drains away, replaced by something else. Calculation. Fear, maybe. Because he's done the math, and the math says Pa Ingalls is right. If he gouges these people now, he'll lose them forever. and a merchant without customers is just a man with a room full of empty shelves. He lowers the price, not to $5, not to $4, to $1.25 per bushel. Just barely above cost. Just enough to cover his expenses and maybe make a tiny profit. But mostly, just enough to keep his reputation intact. The tension breaks. People start talking again, negotiating, figuring out how much wheat they can afford, how long they can make it last. Loftus measures out portions, weighing them on his scale, writing numbers in his ledger with a hand that's steadier than his nerves. And you walk out of that store with 5 pounds of wheat in your sack and it feels heavier than it should. Because it's not just wheat, it's survival. It's proof that the town can hold together even when everything is falling apart. It's proof that Daniel Loftus, for all his calculations and business sense, understands that some things matter more than money. But here's what you don't know yet, what no one knows. That wheat is going to have to last a long, long time, because the trains aren't coming back in February. They're not coming back in March. They're not even coming back in April. The snow keeps falling, the blizzards keep howling, and De Smet stays buried under a white ocean that stretches from horizon to horizon with no end in sight. Carolyn Ingalls grinds that wheat in her coffee mill, 1 cup at a time. Your children eat brown bread and potatoes, nothing else. The men twist hay until their hands crack and bleed. The women stitch and restitch the same worn clothes because there's no fabric to make new ones. And Daniel Loftus stands behind his counter in an empty store watching his inventory dwindle to nothing, knowing that he made the right choice but wondering if it will be enough. Because here's the truth about survival on the Dakota Prairie in the winter of 1881. It's not about who's the strongest or the smartest or the richest. It's about who can hold on the longest, who can endure one more blizzard, one more frozen morning, one more day of hunger and cold and uncertainty, who can look at an empty barrel and a shrinking pile of wheat and still believe that spring will come, and whether Daniel Loftus will still be standing when it does. The wheat doesn't last as long as you hoped. That's the first thing you learn about survival math. 60 bushels sounds like abundance when you're starving. But divide it among 50 families, and suddenly it's not abundance. It's a timer counting down to 0. You're standing in your kitchen on a February morning, and the sound you hear is Caroline Ingalls grinding wheat. It's not a pleasant sound. It's a scraping, mechanical rhythm that goes on for hours. Crank, crank, crank. The coffee mill wasn't designed for this. It was made for grinding coffee beans, a handful at a time, enough for 1 pot. But coffee's gone. Coffee is a memory from before the train stopped. Now the mill grinds wheat kernels, and it takes 20 minutes of cranking to produce 1 cup of coarse flour. Caroline's arm moves in the same circle over and over. Her wrist aches. Her shoulder burns. After an hour, she's ground enough flour for maybe 2 small loaves of bread. After 2 hours, her hand is cramping and she has to switch arms. After 4 hours, she has enough flour to feed her family for 1 day. Tomorrow, she'll do it again. And the bread she makes from it? It's not like any bread you've ever tasted. It's brown, dense, gritty with bits of wheat hull that didn't grind fine enough. It tastes like determination and exhaustion. But it fills your stomach, and that's all that matters anymore. Daniel Loftus watches this happen in every household in De Smet. He sees the women coming to his store with their ration of wheat, carrying it home in flour sacks, their faces drawn and tired. He hears about the hours of grinding, the bread that barely rises, the children who eat it without complaint because they're too hungry to complain, and something shifts in him. In mid-February, Loftus makes a decision. He's going to install a mill in his store. Not a proper grist mill. Those are massive operations powered by water or wind, and De Smet has neither. But a hand-cranked mill, larger than a coffee grinder, capable of grinding wheat into actual flour instead of coarse meal. He orders it from... Wait. No, he can't order it. The trains aren't running, so he builds it. Or he finds someone in town who can build it. The historical record isn't clear on the details, but the result is the same. By late February, there's a mill in the Loftus store, and women can bring their wheat, and have it ground into flour without spending 4 hours destroying their wrists. It's a small thing, but small things matter when you're living on the edge of starvation. That mill means Caroline Ingalls gets 3 hours of her day back. 3 hours she can spend mending clothes or teaching her daughters, or just sitting down because her body's exhausted from grinding and cooking and washing and surviving. And Loftus doesn't charge extra for the grinding. He could. He absolutely could. Every family in town needs flour, and if he charged even a penny per pound for grinding, he'd make money. But he doesn't, because he's learned something from that confrontation in January. He's learned that money isn't the only currency that matters. Reputation matters. Trust matters. And right now, being the man who helps instead of the man who gouges is worth more than pennies. You bring your weekly wheat ration to the store, £5. That's what your family gets. 5 pounds of wheat to stretch across 7 days, and it has to be enough because there's nothing else. No meat, no vegetables. The potatoes in the cellar are gone, the dried beans are gone, the turnips, the carrots, the cabbage, all of it, gone. Loftus takes your wheat, pours it into the mill and cranks the handle. The sound is loud in the empty store, a grinding, crushing sound that echoes off the bare shelves. After 10 minutes, flour pours out the bottom into your sack. Real flour. Fine and white. Well, off-white because it's whole wheat flour, but it's still finer than anything you could grind at home. You thank him. He nods. You walk out into the snow with your sack of flour and you feel something you haven't felt in months. Relief. Not happiness. Not hope. Just the simple relief of knowing that tonight you can make bread that doesn't taste like punishment. But here's what you don't know yet. What no one knows except Loftus, standing alone in his empty store looking at his ledger. The numbers don't add up. He's selling wheat at barely above cost. He's providing grinding services for free. His inventory is gone, his suppliers are unreachable, and the money coming in isn't enough to cover what he owes to those suppliers when, if, the trains ever come back. Daniel Loftus is going bankrupt in slow motion, and he's doing it to keep a town alive that might not remember his sacrifice when spring finally comes. February becomes March, and the blizzards don't stop. You thought they would. Everyone did. There's a superstition on the frontier that winter breaks in late February, that you get a thaw, a few days of warmth, a glimpse of spring to remind you that the world hasn't ended. But not this year. The blizzards come every 3 days, regular as clockwork. The sky turns grey, the wind picks up, and then the snow arrives. Sometimes it lasts 6 hours, sometimes it lasts 3 days, and in between the storms, the cold settles in like something alive and malicious. Temperatures drop to 40 below zero. The air hurts to breathe. Your lungs ache with every inhale. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. You burn twisted hay because there's nothing else left to burn. The woodpile is gone. The coal is gone. Lumber is too expensive and too precious. You can't tear apart your house for firewood, so you make do with hay. You twist it into tight bundles like giant cigars and feed it into the stove. It burns fast and smells like barn animals, and it barely keeps the house above freezing, but it's better than nothing. Men spend hours every day twisting hay. It's mind-numbing work. Grab a handful of hay, twist it tight, twist it tighter. Your hands cramp. Your fingers crack and bleed from the cold and the rough hay stems. But you keep twisting because the alternative is freezing to death. And all the while, you're eating brown bread and potatoes. That's it. That's the entire menu. Brown bread made from Loftus's flour. Potatoes if you're lucky enough to still have some in your cellar. Maybe a tiny bit of salt to make it taste like something other than despair. Caroline Ingalls makes the same bread every day. She mixes the flour with water and a pinch of salt. No yeast. That's gone too. So the bread doesn't rise. It bakes into dense, flat loaves that are more like hardtack than actual bread. She serves it at breakfast. She serves it at dinner. She serves it at supper. And her family eats it without complaint because complaining doesn't make food appear. The children are hungry all the time. Not starving, not yet, but constantly, gnawingly hungry. Their stomachs are never full. The bread fills them temporarily, but an hour later the hunger comes back. They learn not to talk about it. They learn to ignore it. They learn that hunger is just part of life now, like cold and wind and snow. And Daniel Loftus watches all of this from behind his counter. He's rationing the wheat carefully. Every family gets their allotment based on size. A family of 6 gets more than a family of 2. It's fair, it's logical, but it's also brutal because the math is unforgiving. 60 bushels of wheat divided among 50 families, lasting from January to... when? May? June? That's 4 to 5 months. And the wheat is already half gone. Loftus does the calculation in his head every night. 30 bushels left, 5 bushels per week distributed. That's 6 weeks. 6 weeks until the wheat runs out. And then what? He doesn't talk about this with anyone. What would be the point? Panic doesn't create food, but he thinks about it constantly. He lies awake at night in his room above the store, listening to the wind howl, and he thinks, what happens when the wheat is gone? There's no answer. Or rather, the answer is too terrible to say out loud. In early March, a rumour starts. Someone says they heard the railroad is sending ploughs, that crews are fighting through the drifts from the east, that trains will be here by mid-March. The whole town seizes on this rumour like a drowning man grabbing a rope. It has to be true. It has to be. But mid-March comes and goes. No train, no plough, no rescue. Just more snow and more cold and more grinding desperation. You start to notice things you didn't notice before. How thin everyone is. How their clothes hang loose. How the children's faces look gaunt and pale. How people move slower, tire faster, speak less. The cold and hunger are wearing everyone down to nothing. And Loftus's store is the heart of it all. Every day women come to get their flour. Every day Loftus cranks the mill, measures out rations, writes numbers in his ledger. He's become more than a merchant. He's become the town's lifeline, the keeper of the food, the man who decides, fairly, carefully, but decides nonetheless, who gets what and how much and when. It's a terrible kind of power, and he can feel the weight of it crushing him. But here's the thing about Daniel Loftus that the history books sometimes forget. He doesn't break. He doesn't run. He doesn't close his store and save what's left for himself. He keeps showing up. He keeps grinding wheat. He keeps rationing fairly. He keeps doing the impossible work of keeping a town alive when everything says they should be dead. And outside, the wind keeps howling, and the snow keeps falling, and spring stays far, far away. Late March. You're so tired of winter you can't remember what warmth feels like. The sun is a dim memory. Green grass is a fairy tale. The idea of eating something fresh, an apple, a carrot pulled straight from the garden, anything that isn't brown bread seems impossible, like dreaming about flying. You walk into the Loftus store for your weekly ration, and the emptiness hits you all over again. The shelves are bare, not just low, bare, completely, utterly empty. The flour barrels sit on their sides, mouths open, nothing inside but dust. The sugar barrel is gone. The salt pork barrel is gone. The fabric bolts that used to line the walls are gone, cut up and sewn into clothes months ago. Even the coffee mill that families used to borrow is gone, broken from overuse and impossible to replace. The only thing left is the wheat. And there's not much of that either. Loftus stands behind his counter, and he looks older than he did in January. Thinner, more worn. His face has that same gaunt look everyone has now. He's eating the same food as everyone else, brown bread and nothing, and it's written all over him. But he's still here, still measuring, still grinding, still writing numbers in that ledger with hands that shake slightly from cold and exhaustion. You give him your family's ration card, a slip of paper with your name and the number of people in your household. He consults his ledger, nods, and measures out your wheat. 4 pounds this week. It used to be 5. The rations are shrinking. No one says anything about it because everyone knows why. The wheat is running out. Loftus grinds it for you without being asked. The mill's handle goes around and flour pours into your sack. You watch his face while he works. He's not looking at you. He's looking at nothing, his mind somewhere else. Calculating probably. Figuring out how many more weeks the wheat will last. whether the trains will come in time, whether he'll wake up one morning and have to tell the town there's no more food. You take your flour and leave. You don't say anything beyond thank you. There's nothing to say. Words can't change the math. Outside, the wind is blowing. It's always blowing. The snow has been falling for 4.5 months with almost no break. The drifts are so high they've buried entire buildings. Some of the smaller claim shanties on the edge of town have disappeared completely. Just mounds of snow where houses used to be. The streets are tunnels carved through white walls that tower over your head. And the cold is relentless. Even in late March, when the calendar says spring should be arriving, the temperature stays below 0. The sun comes up, crosses the sky, goes down, and the cold doesn't budge. It's like the world is stuck, frozen in place, waiting for something to break. At home, you make bread. The same bread you've made every day for months. Mix flour and water. Add salt if you have it. Knead it into dough. Let it rest, not rise because there's no yeast. Bake it in the oven. Wait. The smell fills the house, and for a moment, it almost smells good. Almost. Then you pull it out and see the same flat brown loaves you've been eating forever, and the illusion breaks. Your children eat it. They don't complain. They've stopped complaining about food weeks ago. They eat what they're given and then go back to their quiet games or their lessons, or they're sitting by the stove staring at nothing. They're too tired to play the way children should play, too hungry, too worn down by the endless winter. And you think, this can't go on much longer. Something has to give. But nothing gives. April comes, and the weather doesn't change. More blizzards, more cold, more snow. The town is buried under drifts that reach 30 feet high in places. The railroad tracks are invisible. The prairie is one unbroken expanse of white stretching to the horizon in every direction, and the wheat is almost gone. Loftus stops grinding flour for free, not because he wants to charge, he doesn't, but because the mill breaks. Something inside it snaps from months of constant use, and suddenly it's just a useless metal box. He tries to fix it. Other men try to fix it. But without parts, without tools, without anything except desperation and hope, it can't be fixed. So you're back to grinding wheat in your coffee mill. Back to 4 hours of cranking for 1 day's worth of bread. Back to Caroline Ingalls standing in her kitchen, arm moving in circles, grinding and grinding and grinding until her whole body aches. The rations shrink again. £3 per family per week. That's barely enough. People are visibly losing weight now. Their clothes hang on them like sacks. Their cheekbones stand out sharp. Their eyes have a hollow, haunted look. And still, Daniel Loftus shows up at his store every day. He measures out wheat with shaking hands. He writes numbers in his ledger with a pencil stub worn down to almost nothing. He looks at his customers, his neighbours, and sees the same thing they see in him. Someone barely holding on. One afternoon in mid-April, you're at the store picking up your ration, and you hear Loftus talking to another man. Their voices are low, but you catch fragments. Maybe 2 more weeks. If the train doesn't come, I don't know what we'll do. 2 more weeks. That's all the wheat that's left. 2 more weeks, and then the town runs out of food completely. And the trains still aren't running. The snow is still falling. Spring is still nowhere in sight. You take your £3 of wheat and walk home through the snow tunnels. And you think about those 2 weeks. You think about what happens after. You think about your children's hungry faces and you think, we've survived this long. We have to survive 2 more weeks. We have to. Because the alternative, the thing no one will say out loud but everyone is thinking, is unthinkable. And somewhere in his empty store, Daniel Loftus is doing the same math, and praying that the trains come before the numbers reach 0. 2 weeks. That's what Loftus said. 2 weeks of wheat left, and then nothing. You counted the days like a prisoner marking time on a cell wall. 14 days, 13, 12. Each morning you woke up and thought, 1 day close to the end. But something strange happens when you live on the edge of disaster for too long. You stop feeling panic. You stop feeling fear. You just feel numb. tired. Like you're walking through a dream where nothing is quite real and nothing matters very much. Late April feels like the 7th month of winter because it is. 7 months since that first blizzard in October. 7 months of cold and snow and wind that never stops. 7 months of brown bread and hunger, and watching your children grow thinner and paler and quieter. The town has gone quiet too. People don't visit anymore. They don't gather at the store to talk and share news. They stay in their houses, burning the last of their twisted hay, eating their rations of bread, waiting, just waiting. For the train, for spring, for something to break. You walk to Loftus's store on a grey morning, and Main Street feels like a ghost town. The snow tunnels are still there, walls of white 10 feet high on either side of the narrow path. But nobody's walking in them. The doors are closed, the windows are dark. It's like the whole town is holding its breath. Inside the store, Loftus measures out your ration. £2 this week. It used to be 5, then 4, then 3, now 2. He doesn't explain why. He doesn't have to. The mathematics of starvation don't need explanation. Less food means smaller portions. Simple as that. His hands shake as he pours wheat into your sack. Not from cold, though it's cold enough, but from exhaustion. From 7 months of carrying the weight of an entire town's survival on his shoulders. From doing the impossible and knowing it's not enough. You take your £2 of wheat and don't say anything. What is there to say? Thank you. For what? For giving you another week of barely surviving. For stretching 60 bushels of wheat across 7 months through some kind of miracle math that defies logic. But you say it anyway. Thank you. Because Daniel Loftus is the reason you're still alive, and that matters even if nothing else does. Outside, the sky's the same grey it's been for months. The wind blows the same cold it's blown since October, and you think, maybe this is it. Maybe this is how the world ends. Not with a bang or a cry, but with quiet exhaustion. With empty shelves and empty stomachs and empty eyes staring at walls made of snow. At home, Caroline Ingalls grinds wheat in her coffee mill. The same sound, the same rhythm. Crank, crank, crank. She's been doing this for so long it's become automatic. Her body moves without her mind directing it. Muscle memory. Survival instinct. But her hands are shaking too. And when she pulls the flour out of the mill, she stares at it for a long moment like she's forgotten what it's for. Like the sight of wheat flour has lost all meaning after months of repetition. She bakes bread, the same flat brown loaves. But when she cuts them open, they're denser than usual, heavier, because she's using less flour, stretching it further, trying to make £2 last longer than £2 can possibly last. Her daughters eat it without complaint. Mary, Laura, Carrie, 3 little girls who've learned that life is brown bread and cold and waiting. They don't ask for more. They don't ask when spring will come. They've stopped asking questions because there are no good answers. And Charles Ingalls sits by the stove twisting hay into fuel, his face carved from stone. He's the one who convinced Loftus to lower that price back in January. He's the one who saved the town from price gouging. But now he's wondering if it mattered. If they're all going to starve anyway, does it matter what they paid for wheat? He doesn't say this out loud, but you can see it in his eyes, the weight of it, the knowledge that they're running out of time. Across town, Daniel Loftus sits in his empty store and stares at his ledger. The numbers don't lie. The wheat will run out in 10 days, maybe less. And then what? He's thought about this moment for months, planned for it, dreaded it. But now that it's here, now that he can actually see the end coming, he doesn't know what to do. How do you tell a town they're out of food? How do you look your neighbours in the eye and say, this is it, there's nothing left, I'm sorry? He closes the ledger, puts his head in his hands, and for the first time in 7 months, Daniel Loftus allows himself to feel the full weight of what he's been carrying. The responsibility, the impossibility, the sheer crushing burden of keeping people alive when survival should have been impossible. And outside the wind keeps howling, the snow keeps falling, and the silence keeps growing. But then, faint, distant, almost imaginary, A sound cuts through the wind. A whistle, long and low and impossible. The sound of a train. You don't believe it at first. Can't believe it. Because you've been fooled before. In March, someone swore they heard a train whistle, and the whole town rushed out into the snow only to find nothing. Just wind. Just hope dying all over again. But this time the whistle comes again. Louder. Closer. And then you hear it. The grinding, chugging, unstoppable sound of a locomotive pushing through snow. People pour out of their houses like they're escaping a fire. Running, stumbling, falling in the snow and getting up and running again. Because it's real. It's actually real. The train is coming. You reach Main Street and everyone is there. The whole town. 50 families, maybe 60. Every single person who survived the winter, standing in the snow tunnel, staring east, waiting for the train to appear. And then it does. The locomotive comes around the bend like something from a dream. Black smoke, steam, the screech of metal wheels on frozen rails. It's beautiful. It's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. Not because it's elegant or impressive, but because it means you're going to live. The train stops at the depot, what's left of it under all that snow. The conductor climbs down and he's staring at the town like he can't believe anyone's still here. Like he expected to find corpses and empty buildings. But you're here, all of you, thin, exhausted, barely standing, but alive. The train is loaded with supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, salt, kerosene, fresh vegetables that make your mouth water just looking at them, potatoes, onions, cabbages, things you haven't seen in 7 months, things you thought you might never see again. And Daniel Loftus is there, standing at the front of the crowd, looking at those supply crates like a man seeing salvation. Because that's what they are, salvation. The difference between 10 more days of survival and 10 more years of life. Men unload the crates. They work fast, urgent. Like if they slow down, the train might disappear. Box after box gets stacked on the platform. Flour sacks, sugar barrels, coffee tins, bolts of fabric, nails, tools. Everything a frontier town needs to be a town again instead of just a collection of people waiting to die. Loftus is already doing math in his head. You can see it. Calculating inventory, planning restock, figuring out pricing. But his face looks different. Lighter. Like 7 months of weight just lifted off his shoulders. The conductor comes over to him, and they talk. You can't hear what they're saying, but you see Loftus nod, and the conductor shake his head in amazement, and both of them look at the town like they're witnessing something impossible. Because it is impossible. A town of 60 families surviving 7 months with no supplies. With nothing but 60 bushels of wheat and determination, and a merchant who refused to give up. The numbers should have killed you all. But somehow, they didn't. The train stays for 2 hours, long enough to unload. Long enough for the conductor to tell stories about the railroad's attempts to get through, about locomotives that derailed, about crews that nearly froze, about snow so deep they had to abandon the ploughs and wait for spring. 132 days, he says. That's how long the blockade lasted, from late December to now. 132 days of complete isolation. No trains, no supplies, no contact with the outside world, and you all survived. Every single one of you. When the train finally pulls away, heading west with a whistle that sounds like a promise to come back, you stand there watching until it disappears, and then you turn and look at your neighbours. Really look at them for the first time in months. You see faces that are too thin, eyes that are too hollow, bodies that are worn down to nothing, but you also see something else. Strength, resilience, the kind of toughness that comes from living through something that should have killed you. Someone starts crying. You're not sure who. Maybe one of the women, maybe one of the men. It doesn't matter. Because suddenly everyone is crying. Quiet, exhausted tears that come from relief and exhaustion and the overwhelming knowledge that you made it. Against all odds, you made it. Daniel Loftus stands in front of his store watching the supply crates get loaded inside. His empty shelves won't be empty anymore. His barrels will be full again. His store will be a store again instead of a rationing station. But he doesn't look happy. He looks tired, bone deep, tired, like a man who's been running for 7 months and finally gets to stop. Someone comes up to him, Charles Ingalls. Pa. They don't say anything at first. Just stand there together, two men who carried their families through hell and came out the other side. Then Pa extends his hand, and Loftus takes it, and they shake. Not as merchant and customer, as survivors, as people who did the impossible together. And that handshake says everything words can't. The first thing you eat is an apple, not bread, not potatoes. An apple, fresh and crisp and sweet and so shockingly delicious after 7 months of brown bread that you actually cry while you're eating it. Your children eat slowly, savouring every bite. Like they're afraid if they eat too fast the apple will disappear and they'll wake up back in the grey world of January. But the apple is real. The train was real. The supplies are real. Winter is over. Except winter isn't quite over. Not really. Because even though the train came, even though the supplies are here, the cold doesn't stop. May in Dakota Territory is still freezing. The snow is still piled high. The wind still blows. Spring is coming, but it's taking its time. And there's something else that doesn't stop. The hunger. Your body has been starving for months, and one apple doesn't fix that. One meal doesn't fix that. Your stomach has shrunk. Your body has learned to survive on almost nothing. And now, with food finally available, you have to relearn how to eat. Carolyn Ingalls makes soup with real vegetables. Potatoes and onions and carrots simmering in water with a bit of salt. It's the simplest meal imaginable, but to your family it tastes like a feast. The girls eat slowly, their eyes wide, like they can't believe this is happening. And that night, for the first time in months, everyone goes to bed with full stomachs. Not barely satisfied, not still hungry, actually full. It's a strange feeling, almost uncomfortable. Your body doesn't remember what full feels like. At the Loftus store, business picks up immediately. Everyone needs everything. Flour for baking, sugar for coffee, coffee itself. Fabric for clothes that have been mended too many times. Nails for repairs. Seeds for planting because spring might be late, but planting season can't wait forever. Loftus works from dawn until dark, restocking shelves, taking orders, filling requests. His store transforms from an empty shell to a real store again. Bags of flour stacked against the wall, sugar barrels full, coffee tins lined up in neat rows. It looks like October again, before the winter, before the nightmare. But Loftus himself doesn't transform. He's still thin, still exhausted, still carrying something heavy that you can't quite see. Because here's what nobody talks about in the celebrations and relief of the train's arrival. Daniel Loftus is ruined, financially ruined. He sold wheat at cost. He provided grinding services for free. He kept a town alive when he should have been protecting his own business interests. And now the bills are coming due. The wholesalers in Chicago want their money. The railroad wants payment for freight. And Loftus doesn't have it. He owes thousands of dollars. And his store made almost nothing during the winter because survival doesn't generate profit. Keeping people alive doesn't pay the bills, and now he's staring at bankruptcy. But something interesting happens. Something the ledgers and account books can't measure. People remember. They remember the merchant who didn't gouge when he could have, who installed a mill when he didn't have to, who stood behind his counter every single day for 7 months, rationing fairly, measuring carefully, keeping them alive. And they reward that memory with loyalty. When people need flour, they buy it from Loftus. When they need fabric or nails or coffee or anything, they go to his store, not because his prices are the lowest, not because his selection is the best, but because he's the man who saved them, and they don't forget. Within weeks, the Loftus store is doing more business than it ever did before the winter. Within months, he's paying down his debts. Within a year, the store is thriving. And Daniel Loftus, the merchant who should have gone bankrupt, becomes one of the most successful businessmen in De Smet. He runs that store for 43 more years. 43 years of serving the community, of being the man everyone trusts, the man who proved that there are things more important than profit. That reputation matters, that doing the right thing during a crisis creates a kind of wealth that no ledger can measure. And when he finally dies in 1923, the whole town turns out for his funeral. Not because he was rich or famous or powerful, but because he was the man who kept them alive when survival should have been impossible. But that's all in the future. Right now, in May of 1881, Loftus is just tired. He's standing in his restocked store looking at shelves that are full again, and he's thinking about those 7 months, the empty barrels, the desperate faces, the impossible mathematics of 60 bushels divided among 50 families across 7 months. And he's thinking, we made it. All of us. Together. We actually made it. Outside, the snow is finally starting to melt. Not quickly. Nothing happens quickly on the Dakota Prairie, but steadily. The drifts shrink inch by inch. The sun feels warmer each day. The wind loses its killing edge. And one morning in late May, you wake up and see something you haven't seen since October. Grass. Just a tiny patch of brown grass poking through the melting snow. But it's there. Proof that winter doesn't last forever. That the earth remembers how to be alive. Children play outside for the first time in months. They run and shout and throw snowballs that are half snow, half mud. They're still too thin, still too pale, but they're laughing. And that sound, children laughing, is the sound of a town coming back to life. Carolyn Ingalls plants a garden. The ground is barely thawed, but she plants anyway. Carrots and beans and potatoes. Food for next winter, because there will be a next winter. And when it comes, she'll be ready. They'll all be ready. Because they know now what they're capable of surviving. And Daniel Loftus stands in the doorway of his store watching the town wake up from its long nightmare. And he allows himself something he hasn't felt in 7 months. Pride. Not in the money he made, because he didn't make any, but in the lives he saved, in the town that survived because he refused to give up. The long winter is over, and de smet endures. When you read about the long winter in history books, you read about merchants and trains and bushels of wheat. You read about men making decisions, men negotiating prices, men riding south through blizzards to find food. The stories are full of action and drama and heroism. But here's what the history books don't tell you. While the men were at the store discussing wheat prices, the women were home turning that wheat into food. And that transformation, from kernel to bread, was the real miracle of survival. Carolyn Ingalls' war didn't happen in a store or on a sled riding through snow. It happened in her kitchen every single day for 7 months. 4 hours of grinding wheat in a coffee mill, her right arm moving in circles until it went numb, then switching to her left arm when the right one gave out, then back to the right when the left one cramped up. Hour after hour after hour. Her wrists swelled. The joint ached constantly. Some mornings she could barely grip the mill handle because her hands were so stiff from the previous day's grinding. But she ground anyway. Because if she didn't grind, there was no flour. And if there was no flour, there was no bread. And if there was no bread, her children starved. That's not dramatic. It's not heroic in the way we usually think of heroism. There's no climactic moment. No life or death decision. Just the same exhausting work repeated every day until your body breaks down and you keep going anyway because there's no other choice. And Caroline wasn't alone. Every woman in Desmet was fighting the same war, grinding wheat, baking bread, stretching 2 pounds of flour across 7 days, watching their children grow thinner and trying not to let the fear show on their faces. They managed household rations with mathematical precision. If each person gets 4 ounces of bread per day, that's 1 pound 12 ounces per week for a family of 6. But you only have 2 pounds of flour, so you make the bread thinner, flatter. You add more water to stretch it. You tell your children it's a new recipe, not starvation math. And when the bread comes out dense and brown and barely edible, you serve it with a smile. You say it's good. You say it's enough. You lie with your face and your voice because your children need to believe everything is fine even when nothing is fine. The women also managed the fuel crisis. When the wood ran out and the coal was gone and the men brought home armfuls of hay, it was the women who figured out how to burn it, how to twist it tight enough to burn slow, how to time the feeding of the stove so the house stayed warm enough to survive but didn't use up all the hay before tomorrow. They washed clothes in water heated over hay fires that barely got warm. They mended the same dresses and shirts over and over because there was no fabric for new ones. They kept children occupied and educated and relatively sane during 7 months of confinement in houses too small for that much togetherness. And none of it appears in the ledgers. None of it gets recorded in the official history. Daniel Loftus wrote down every bushel of wheat sold. The railroad documented every failed attempt to break through the snow, but nobody documented the number of hours Caroline Ingalls spent grinding wheat. Nobody counted the loaves of brown bread she baked. Nobody measured the fuel she saved through careful rationing or the clothing she preserved through endless mending. Women's work was invisible because it happened in homes instead of stores, because it was daily instead of dramatic, because it was expected instead of exceptional. But here's the truth. De Smet survived because of the women as much as the men, maybe more, because Loftus could ration wheat, but he couldn't turn it into edible food. Almanzo could bring wheat back from the south, but he couldn't make it last 7 months through careful household management. The men controlled the supply, but the women controlled the survival, and they did it while being completely invisible to the historical record. No newspaper articles about Caroline Ingalls' contribution to town survival. No recognition that her 4 hours of daily grinding was economic labour, not domestic duty. No acknowledgement that managing household food rations during a famine requires skill and intelligence and endurance equal to any business calculation. Historians call this a methodological gap, a polite way of saying, we don't know what the women did because nobody thought it was worth writing down. But the women know. The daughters who watch their mothers grind and bake and ration and survive. They know. Laura Ingalls knew. She watched her mother's hands turn the coffee mill handle day after day. She saw the exhaustion, the pain, the quiet, relentless determination to keep her family alive no matter what it cost. And 70 years later, when Laura sat down to write about the long winter, she put her mother in the centre of the story, not as background, not as a supporting character, as the person who made survival possible through sheer, grinding, invisible labour. That's the story history almost lost. The Women's War, the battle fought with coffee mills and bread dough and mathematical precision. The victory that saved a town without anyone noticing it was happening. 7 months is a long time to be afraid. Long enough that fear stops feeling like fear and starts feeling like normal, like the baseline state of existence. You wake up afraid, you go to bed afraid, and in between, you just live with it. Nobody in De Smet talked about the fear, not directly. Because talking about it would make it real in a way that silence didn't. So people said other things instead. They said, the train will come soon. They said, we just have to make it a little longer. They said, spring always comes eventually. But what they meant was, I'm terrified we're going to die. The children felt it most, not because they understood the danger, most of them were too young for that, but because they absorbed their parents' fear like a sickness in the air. Mary and Laura and Carrie Ingalls didn't need anyone to explain that things were wrong. They could see it in their mother's face, hear it in their father's silence, feel it in the tension that never quite went away. Laura was 13 that winter, old enough to understand hunger, old enough to see how thin everyone was getting, old enough to do the math and realise the wheat was running out faster than spring was arriving, but not old enough to do anything about it except wait and watch and try not to think about what happened if the train never came. She watched her little sister Carrie grow quiet, watched Mary, who was always the good one, the obedient one, become even more careful about not causing trouble, because trouble meant extra stress, and their parents were already carrying all the stress they could hold. Children learn to be invisible during crises, to take up less space, to need less, to not ask for things they know their parents can't provide. It's a survival skill, but it costs something. It costs childhood, and the adults paid their own price. The historical record doesn't talk about the psychological toll of 7 months of slow-motion crisis, but you can read it between the lines if you know what to look for. Charles Ingalls, Pa, spent hours every day twisting hay into fuel. It was mind-numbing, physically painful work that accomplished almost nothing. Hay burns fast and produces little heat. You could twist hay all day and barely keep a house warm for a few hours. But he did it anyway because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing meant admitting there was nothing to be done. That's what happens when you're powerless. When the trains won't run and the snow won't stop and the wheat won't stretch and there's absolutely nothing you can do to fix any of it. You find small tasks and do them over and over, because movement feels like progress even when it isn't. Daniel Loftus had a different torture. He had the numbers. He knew exactly when the wheat would run out. He lived with that countdown in his head every single day. 10 weeks, 9 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 weeks, 4, 2. And he had to stand behind his counter and measure out rations and look his neighbours in the eye, knowing that in 2 weeks he'd have nothing left to give them. That's not a burden anyone should have to carry, but he carried it alone because sharing it would have caused panic, and panic wouldn't have helped anyone survive. The town developed what psychologists now call disaster fatigue. The constant stress of crisis stops producing adrenaline and starts producing numbness. People stopped reacting to the blizzards, stopped being surprised by the cold, stopped hoping the train would come today or tomorrow or next week. They just endured. 1 day at a time, 1 meal at a time, 1 hour at a time, and that endurance came with a cost. Depression settled over dismay like the snow. People moved slower, spoke less, smiled rarely. It wasn't dramatic. There were no breakdowns or outbursts, just a slow grey dimming of the light behind people's eyes. But here's the thing about communities under siege. They develop their own coping mechanisms, unspoken agreements about what you do and don't acknowledge, about what you say and don't say. You don't say, "We might all die." You say, "Spring is coming." You don't say, "I'm terrified." You say, "We'll be fine." You don't say, "What if the train never comes?" You say, "When the train comes," language becomes a survival tool. Words create a shared reality that's better than the actual reality. Not lies exactly. More like agreed upon optimism, a collective decision to live as if survival is certain even when it isn't. And it worked. Not because the optimism was true, but because it kept people moving forward instead of giving up. Because hope, even false hope, is more survivable than despair. The children who lived through the long winter carried it with them forever. Laura wrote about it 70 years later, and you can still feel the fear in her words, the memory of hunger, of cold, of watching her parents struggle and being too young to help. But she also remembered something else, the fact that they made it. All of them. Together. Against odds that should have killed them. And that memory mattered more than the fear. The long winter of 1880-81 ended in May, but its meaning didn't end. It rippled outward through years and lives and communities in ways that nobody could have predicted while they were grinding wheat and burning hay and waiting for trains that wouldn't come. Daniel Loftus became a legend in his own lifetime, not because he was a great businessman, though he became successful, but because he chose community over profit when it mattered most. He ran the Loftus store until 1923, 43 years after the winter that almost killed him and everyone else. And during all those years, people remembered. They remembered the merchant who didn't gouge, who installed a mill for free, who rationed fairly when he could have played favourites, who stood behind his counter every single day during the worst crisis any of them ever faced and refused to give up. That reputation became currency. People drove past closer stores to shop at Loftus's. They paid his prices without complaint even when competitors charged less, because they owed him something that couldn't be measured in dollars. They owed him their lives. When Loftus died in 1923, The entire town attended his funeral. Men and women in their 60s and 70s who remembered being children during that winter. Middle-aged adults who'd been born just after. Young people who only knew the stories. They came because Daniel Loftus represented something bigger than one merchant in one store during one winter. He represented the idea that business can be moral, that profit isn't the only thing that matters, that you can do well by doing good, and in an era of robber barons and ruthless capitalism that idea mattered. But the winter's legacy extended beyond one man. It changed how De Smet thought about community. Before the winter, the town was just a collection of individuals pursuing their own interests, homesteaders claiming land, merchants making profit, everyone out for themselves in the way frontier mythology celebrated. The winter shattered that mythology. It proved that survival wasn't individual, it was collective. You survived because your neighbour shared fuel, because the merchant rationed fairly, because the women supported each other through the invisible labour of feeding families, because everyone agreed that keeping the community alive mattered more than individual gain. Historians call this moral economy, the idea that communities operate on more than pure market forces, that there's a social contract about fair prices and just distribution, that when merchants violate that contract, the community has the right and the obligation to push back. Charles Ingalls' confrontation with Loftus wasn't just about wheat prices, it was about defending that social contract, reminding the merchant that he wasn't separate from the community, that his success depended on their survival, that they were all in this together whether he liked it or not. And Loftus listened. That's the part that matters. He could have refused, could have charged whatever he wanted and faced the consequences later, but he didn't, because he understood that Pa Ingalls was right, that reputation and trust were more valuable than short-term profit, that being part of a community meant accepting responsibility to that community. This tension between individual interest and collective good defines every crisis. During the long winter, De Smet chose collective good, and they survived because of that choice. Imagine if Loftus had held firm at $5 per bushel. Some families would have bought wheat, others wouldn't have been able to afford it. The town would have fractured into those who could eat and those who couldn't, and when spring came and people looked back at who survived and who didn't, the community would have torn itself apart. Instead, everyone survived. Not comfortably, not without suffering, but together. And that shared survival created bonds that lasted generations. The children of the long winter, Laura and Mary and Carrie and all the others, grew up with a different understanding of what community means than their parents had. They'd seen what people were capable of enduring together. They'd seen neighbours help neighbours when there was nothing left to give. They'd seen adults make impossible decisions and choose fairness over self-interest. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about it because she understood that the story mattered, not just as history but as instruction, as proof that when systems fail, and systems always eventually fail, what saves you is people, not institutions, not technology, not money. People choosing to take care of each other even when it cost them. She published The Long Winter in 1940 during the Great Depression. When banks were failing and jobs were gone and families were struggling just to eat, and American readers saw themselves in that Dakota Territory winter, saw the same fear, the same scarcity, the same question. Will we make it through this? And Laura's answer was yes, but only if you do what De Smet did. Only if you choose community over individualism, fairness over profit, shared survival over personal gain. That's why this story still matters. Because crises keep coming. Climate change, pandemics, economic collapse, supply chain failures. The details change, but the fundamental question stays the same. When things fall apart, what holds people together? The answer, from the long winter of 1880-81, is this: shared values, trust, the willingness to sacrifice personal gain for collective survival. And leadership, from merchants, from fathers, from mothers, from anyone willing to step up and say, we're all in this together. Daniel Loftus wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't ride through blizzards or make grand speeches. He just showed up every day and did the work, rationed fairly, shared resources, chose long-term community trust over short-term profit. Caroline Ingalls wasn't celebrated for her contribution, but she kept her family alive through 4 hours of grinding every day and mathematical rationing and quiet, relentless endurance. Charles Ingalls stood up to a merchant when it would have been easier to stay quiet, spoke for the community when speaking up risked everything, and all of them, the merchant, the parents, the children, the entire town, survived because they refused to let each other fail. That's the lesson. That's what the long winter teaches us. Not that survival is easy, not that heroes ride in to save you, but that ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary determination can survive the impossible, if they do it together. When you live through something impossible, it changes your relationships forever. Not in dramatic ways, not in ways you can easily explain, but in the quiet spaces between words, in the way you look at someone and know they understand without speaking, in the knowledge that you survived something together that should have killed you both. Caroline and Charles Ingalls' marriage was tested by the long winter in ways neither of them expected. They'd been through hard times before. Everyone on the frontier had. But 7 months of watching your children go hungry while you can't fix it, that's different. That's the kind of pressure that breaks some marriages and forges others into something unbreakable. Charles twisted hay for hours every day, and Caroline ground wheat, and they barely spoke because what was there to say? They both knew they were failing. They both knew they were doing everything possible and it still wasn't enough. They both knew that if the train didn't come, their children might starve, and there was nothing either of them could do about it. But here's what happened instead of breaking. They became a unit. Not partners, not companions, something deeper. 2 people carrying impossible weight and choosing every single day to keep carrying it together. Charles didn't blame Caroline for the bread being gritty. Caroline didn't blame Charles for failing to provide. They just kept going, side by side. Day after impossible day. That's not romantic, it's not the kind of love story anyone writes poems about. But it's real. It's the kind of strength that builds marriages that last 50 years. The kind of bond that says, we survived the worst together, so whatever comes next, we can handle it. And the mother-daughter relationships, they transformed in ways that mark those girls for life. Mary was 15 that winter, old enough to help, old enough to understand the danger. She watched her mother grind wheat until her hands shook, and she learned what it means to keep going when your body says stop. She learned that being a woman on the frontier means carrying loads that should break you, and carrying them anyway because there's no other option. Laura was 13, the age where you're not quite a child but not yet an adult. The age where you watch everything and understand more than anyone thinks you do. She saw her mother's fear, saw her father's helplessness, saw the town teetering on the edge of disaster, and she learned something that shaped her entire life. Ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary determination can survive the impossible. Years later, when Laura sat down to write about the long winter, she didn't write about heroes. She wrote about her mother grinding wheat, about her father twisting hay, about neighbours sharing the last bit of food, about ordinary people being extraordinary simply by refusing to give up. That's what daughters learn from mothers during crises. Not how to be perfect, how to endure, how to keep your family fed and safe and relatively sane when the world is falling apart around you. How to be afraid and do the work anyway. And the neighbour relationships, they transformed from polite acquaintance to something deeper, something tribal. Women in De Smet developed unspoken agreements during that winter. You don't talk about how scared you are in front of the children. You don't complain about the food because everyone's eating the same thing. You don't ask if someone else has more because you already know they don't. You share whatever you have, even when it's almost nothing, because next week you might be the one who needs help. These weren't formal rules. Nobody announced them. But every woman in town understood them because survival depended on it. The town became a network of women holding each other up through sheer collective will. When one mother's hands were too swollen from grinding to hold the mill handle, another came over and ground for her. When a child got sick and needed extra food, families gave from their own rations without being asked. When someone broke down crying from exhaustion and fear, others just sat with her until the storm passed. This is the kind of community women build during crisis. Not committees, not organizations, just quiet, practical, relentless support, showing up, helping without being asked, understanding without explanation. The men had their war, fighting blizzards, finding wheat, making business decisions, but the women had a different war. The war of making those decisions matter, of turning wheat into food, of managing fear so it didn't destroy families, of maintaining hope when every logical reason to hope was gone. And they won, every single one of them, not because they were special. Not because they were particularly strong or brave or capable, but because they chose each day to keep showing up for each other, to keep grinding wheat and baking bread and telling children everything would be fine, to keep being the bonds that held families together when everything else was falling apart. That's not the history that gets recorded, but it's the history that mattered most. The women who held the world together while everyone else worried about wheat prices and train schedules. The invisible force that turned survival from impossible to inevitable. 60 years after the long winter, Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down to write about it. She was in her 70s, living in Missouri. The frontier was long gone, replaced by highways and electricity and modern conveniences that would have seemed like magic in 1880. But when she closed her eyes, she could still feel that winter, could still hear the wind, could still taste the brown bread, could still see her mother's hands turning the coffee mill handle. Vince a review. Why write about it after 60 years? Because some memories don't fade, because trauma marks you even when you survive it. Because Laura understood that what happened in De Smet during the winter of 1880-81 mattered beyond one town and one season. It was a story about what people are capable of when pushed to the absolute edge of survival. But here's the thing. Laura didn't write a history book. She wrote a story. And the story she told was different from the one Daniel Loftus might have told. Different from the one the railroad company would have documented. Different from the official records and newspaper accounts. Laura wrote about what it felt like to be 13 years old and hungry all the time, to watch your little sister Carrie get thinner and quieter, to see your mother's hands shake from exhaustion, to hear your father talking quietly with Ma late at night when they thought you were asleep, discussing things children weren't supposed to know about. She wrote about fear. Real fear. Not adventure story fear where you know the hero will win. But the grinding daily fear that comes from not knowing if you'll survive. The fear that makes you check the flour sack every morning to see how much is left. The fear that makes every blizzard feel like the one that might finally kill you. And she wrote about her mother. In Laura's story, Carolyn Ingalls is the centre. Not Pa with his fiddle and his optimism. Not the dramatic wheat rescue. But Ma, grinding wheat day after day. Ma, baking bread that barely qualified as bread. Ma, keeping her daughters calm and educated and relatively normal, while everything around them was completely abnormal. Laura saw what history books miss, that her mother's daily, unglamorous, exhausting work was what actually kept the family alive. That grinding wheat for 4 hours was harder than riding through a blizzard for 4 hours because you had to do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. No glory, no recognition, just the work. She saw her mother's strength, and she learned what strength actually looks like. Not muscles, not loudness, not dramatic gestures, but quiet, relentless persistence. The ability to wake up and do the impossible thing again, even though you did it yesterday, and will have to do it again tomorrow. That lesson shaped Laura's entire life. She became a farm wife, raised a daughter, survived droughts and debt and loss, and through all of it, she channeled her mother's example. You do the work, you keep going, you don't give up even when giving up would be easier. But there's something else Laura understood that took her 60 years to articulate. She was a witness. At 13, she was old enough to see and remember everything. young enough to be powerless to change any of it. That's a heavy burden, watching people you love suffer and being unable to help. So she did the only thing she could do. She remembered. She paid attention to details. She noticed how Ma's face looked in the morning, how Pa's shoulders slumped when another blizzard hit, how Mary tried to be extra good so she wouldn't add to the stress. How Carrie stopped asking for things because she somehow understood there was nothing to give. And 60 years later, she wrote it all down. Not for revenge, not for therapy, but because she understood that bearing witness is a responsibility, that someone needs to remember what it was actually like, what people actually felt, what they actually survived. When Laura published The Long Winter in 1940, America was in the Great Depression. People were hungry, scared, uncertain about the future. They read Laura's story and saw themselves, saw that other people had been this scared before, had been this desperate, and had survived. That's why Laura wrote it. Not as history, as hope, as proof that impossible situations are survivable if you refuse to give up and if you take care of each other. As evidence that ordinary people contain extraordinary capacity for endurance. She wrote it for the women reading by lamplight, worried about feeding their families, for the mothers trying to stay strong for their children, for the daughters watching their parents struggle and wondering if they'll be strong enough when their time comes. She wrote it to say, "You are stronger than you know. Your daily work matters more than dramatic gestures. Your quiet persistence is heroism, even if no one calls it that. You can survive things that should break you, and you can do it with grace." That's the gift Laura gave, not history. Truth. The truth about what strength looks like. The truth about what women are capable of. The truth about survival being a choice you make every day, not a destiny you're born with. And that truth still matters. Here's what they don't tell you about strength. You don't know you have it until you need it. You can't measure it or test it or prove it beforehand. You just wake up one day facing something impossible, and you make a choice. You either crumble or you don't. And the women of De Smet didn't crumble. Not because they were special, not because they were naturally tough or particularly brave, but because they were mothers, wives, daughters, sisters. Women whose families needed them to keep going, so they kept going. Simple as that. Brutal as that. Carolyn Ingalls didn't wake up in October 1880 thinking she was capable of grinding wheat for 4 hours a day for 7 months. She probably would have said she wasn't, would have looked at that future and thought it was impossible. But then October came, then November, then December. And each day she made the same choice, do the work or watch your children starve. So she did the work. That's not dramatic strength. That's not the strength of warriors or heroes. That's the strength of women who love their families more than they love comfort, who can endure anything if enduring it means their children survive. It's a different kind of strength, quieter, less celebrated, but no less real. And every woman in De Smet discovered that same strength. The women history doesn't name, the ones who didn't write memoirs or become famous, the merchants' wives, the homesteaders' daughters, the widows managing alone. They all found capacity they didn't know they had, because that's what crisis does. It strips away everything comfortable and familiar until you're left with only what's essential. And what's essential is this. People who refuse to give up usually don't. People who keep showing up usually keep surviving. Strength isn't about never being afraid or tired or overwhelmed. It's about being all those things and doing the work anyway. The women of De Smet teach us something modern life makes us forget. You are capable of more than you think. Not in dramatic ways, not in movie moment ways, but in the daily grind ways, in the keep going when you want to quit ways, in the do it again tomorrow ways. That's the strength that matters. That's the strength that saves families and communities. Not dramatic rescue missions, not heroic gestures, just ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary persistence. And there's something else the women of De Smet teach us. Resilience isn't about bouncing back. It's about moving forward changed. Carolyn Ingalls wasn't the same person in May 1881 that she'd been in October 1880. How could she be? She'd survived something that should have killed her family, discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, endured 7 months of fear and hunger and bone-crushing exhaustion. She didn't bounce back. She moved forward, carried the weight of that experience with her forever. Let it shape her. Let it teach her. Let it prove that she was capable of surviving things she'd thought were unsurvivable. That's real resilience, not pretending trauma didn't happen, not minimizing what you survived, but acknowledging it, carrying it, learning from it, and refusing to let it destroy you. Every woman in De Smet carried the long winter with them for the rest of their lives. They flinched at the sound of wind. They never quite trusted October weather again. They kept extra food stored away just in case. They never forgot what it felt like to be that afraid, that hungry, that helpless. But they also never forgot what they were capable of, what they'd survived, what they'd discovered about their own strength. And that knowledge changed them, made them different, made them women who knew they could survive the next crisis because they'd already survived the worst one. For modern women, the lessons are the same. You're stronger than you know. Your daily work matters. Your quiet persistence is heroism. You can survive things that terrify you, and you don't have to do it alone, because that's the other lesson from De Smet. Women survive together, not as competition, not as judgment, but as community, as support networks. As people who understand what it costs to keep a family running and fed and relatively sane during hard times. When you're grinding wheat in 2026, metaphorically or literally, when you're working 2 jobs or managing illness or surviving loss or just trying to get through another day of too much responsibility and not enough resources, you're doing what Caroline Ingalls did, what every woman in De Smet did, what women have always done. You're choosing to keep going, to do the work, to feed your people, to hold your world together through sheer determination. That's not weakness. That's not settling. That's strength. Real strength. The strength that builds families and communities and futures. And you're not alone in it. Women before you survived worse with less. Women around you are fighting the same battles. Women after you will need the same strength. You're part of an unbroken chain of women who refused to give up, who chose endurance, who did the impossible and called it Tuesday. That's the legacy of the long winter, not the wheat prices or the train schedules or the historical footnotes, but the women, the ones who held the world together while everyone else worried about everything else, the ones who turned wheat kernels into bread and fear into determination and impossible situations into survival stories. Their names mostly didn't make the history books. Their daily work mostly wasn't recorded. Their contributions mostly went unrecognised. But they saved a town, raised children who remembered, created a legacy of strength that echoes forward through generations. And when you face your own impossible winter, whatever form it takes, you can remember them. Remember that ordinary women did extraordinary things simply by refusing to quit. Remember that your daily work matters even if no one applauds it. Remember that quiet strength is still strength. Remember Caroline Ingalls grinding wheat. Remember the merchant's wife keeping store. Remember the neighbours helping neighbours. Remember the daughters learning resilience from their mothers. Remember the women whose names we don't know but whose strength saved lives. Remember that you come from that. You carry that in you. The strength of women who survived impossible things and raised daughters who survived impossible things and created a legacy that says, you can do this. It will be hard, it will cost you, but you can do it. And you don't have to do it alone. That's what the long winter really means. Not history, hope. Not the past, the present. Not what happened to them. What's possible for us. Their strength becomes yours. Their survival proves yours is possible. Their story says whatever winter you're facing, spring will come. You just have to hold on. Summer 1881 arrived like a stranger. The sun felt wrong, too bright, too warm. The green grass sprouting through melting snow looked alien after 7 months of nothing but white. You walked outside without a coat for the first time since October, and your body didn't quite believe it was safe. Some part of you was still waiting for the temperature to drop. for the wind to start howling, for winter to come back and finish what it started. Caroline Ingalls planted a garden in June. But it wasn't like the gardens she'd planted before. This one was bigger, more urgent. She planted twice as many potatoes, triple the carrots. Every available inch of soil got seeds because the memory of hunger was too fresh to ignore. Her hands shook while she worked, not from cold this time, but from the desperate need to never be that helpless again. Every family in De Smet did the same thing. Gardens that used to be practical became obsessive. Root cellars that used to hold a season's worth of vegetables were rebuilt to hold 2 seasons, 3. Enough that even if the train stopped again, even if another winter came, there would be something. Anything. A buffer against the terror of watching your children starve. But food was only part of the recovery. Bodies heal faster than minds. By July, people had regained the weight they'd lost. Children's faces filled out. Women's hands stopped shaking from exhaustion. Men rebuilt strength in their shoulders and backs. Physically, the town recovered. Emotionally, that was different. You'd think survival would feel like victory, like relief, and it did for a while. The first fresh vegetables from the garden tasted like miracles. The first meal with meat, actual meat, not just bread, felt like luxury. The warm summer nights when you didn't have to burn anything for heat felt like freedom. But underneath the relief was something else. Something nobody talked about, but everyone felt. Fear. Deep, persistent fear that it could happen again. That next October would bring another blizzard. That next winter would trap you again. That you'd have to do it all over. And alongside the fear was exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. Sleep fixed that. But the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from 7 months of constant crisis. From living on the edge of disaster so long that even when the disaster ends, your body doesn't quite believe it. Caroline Ingalls would be making bread in her kitchen, and suddenly her hands would freeze on the dough. She'd be back in winter, grinding wheat, watching her children grow thinner. The smell of bread would trigger it, the sound of wind, the sight of snow clouds forming in October. Triggers everywhere. Memories she couldn't escape. She wasn't alone. Every woman in De Smet had her own triggers, every man, every child. The sound of a train whistle made people cry because it meant supplies were coming and they'd been so sure supplies would never come again. The sight of full store shelves felt unreal. How could there be this much food? How could it be this easy? It wasn't post-traumatic stress disorder. That term wouldn't exist for another 50 years, but the reality of it was there. People jumped at loud noises, had trouble sleeping, woke up in the middle of the night checking food supplies, felt anxious every time the weather turned cold, couldn't fully relax because some part of them was always waiting for the next crisis. And there was guilt. Survivor's guilt, though they didn't have a name for that either. The knowledge that they'd made it when other towns hadn't, that everyone in De Smet survived when statistically some of them should have died. Why them? Why did they get to live when winter was killing people all across the Dakota Territory? Parents felt guilty about what they'd put their children through. Caroline Ingalls looked at Laura and Mary and Carrie and saw how thin they'd gotten, how quiet they'd become, how the winter had stolen their childhood in ways she couldn't fix. She'd kept them alive, she'd done everything possible, but she couldn't give them back the 7 months they'd lost to fear and hunger. Charles felt guilty that he couldn't provide better, that he'd moved his family to the frontier promising opportunity and nearly gotten them killed, that his daughters had eaten nothing but brown bread for months because he couldn't hunt or farm or buy anything better. Logic said it wasn't his fault, but guilt doesn't care about logic, and the children, they felt guilty for being burdens, for needing food when there wasn't enough, for making their parents worry, for not being able to help more. They'd learned during the winter to take up less space, to need less, to be less trouble, and that lesson didn't go away just because summer came. So the town recovered, but recovery wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't relief and celebration and moving on. It was complicated, messy, full of contradictions. grateful to be alive but haunted by how close they'd come to dying. Stronger for surviving but broken by the cost of survival. Together in shared experience but isolated in individual trauma. The summer of 1881 was warm and green and full of growing things. But underneath the life returning to the prairie, De Smet carried scars that would never fully heal. De Smet after the long winter wasn't the same town it had been before. How could it be? You don't survive something like that unchanged. The buildings looked the same, the streets ran in the same directions, but the people were different, and the relationships between them had fundamentally shifted. Some bonds that had been casual before the winter became unbreakable after. The women who'd shared flour when there was no flour to share. The neighbours who'd ground wheat for families too exhausted to grind it themselves. The men who'd twisted hay together in silent solidarity. Those weren't just neighbours anymore. They were something more. Family, almost. Bound by shared survival in ways that couldn't be explained to anyone who hadn't been there. You could see it in how they looked at each other. The understanding that passed without words. The way someone would mention October and everyone would nod because they all knew exactly what October meant. The way children playing would suddenly go quiet when snow clouds appeared in the sky, and parents would exchange glances that said, "We remember. We'll never forget." Daniel Loftus's place in the town transformed completely. Before the winter, he'd been the merchant, respected for his business, patronised for his goods, but separate. An outsider with capital trying to make his way on the frontier. After the winter, he was one of them. More than one of them. He was the man who'd kept them alive. People didn't forget the price confrontation, but they remembered what came after more. They remembered the mill he installed, the fare rationing, the fact that he stood behind that counter every single day when he could have closed up and saved what little he had for himself. They remembered that he chose community over profit when it mattered most, and they rewarded that choice with loyalty that turned his struggling store into the most successful business in De Smet. 43 years he ran that store. 43 years of people choosing to shop there because they remembered. Because gratitude and trust aren't just emotions, they're economic forces. But not all relationships survived. Some marriages that had been struggling before the winter broke completely after. 7 months of fear and hunger and confinement tested bonds, and some of them snapped. A few families left De Smet that summer, unable to face another winter in the place that had nearly killed them, unable to stay in a town full of people who'd witnessed their fear and desperation. Others doubled down, invested harder, built bigger. Planted deeper roots, as if by refusing to leave, by choosing De Smet despite everything, they could somehow transform the trauma into meaning, could prove that survival was worth it, that they'd made the right choice to come here, that their children's suffering hadn't been for nothing. The town developed an unspoken code. You didn't talk about the worst moments. You didn't discuss how scared you were or what you'd been willing to do if the wheat ran out. You didn't mention the thoughts that kept you awake at 3 a.m. when the blizzards howled and you wondered if you'd see sunrise. Instead, you talked about the good parts. The train arriving, the first meal after, the relief. You turned the winter into a story, a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, a tale of frontier hardship and American perseverance. You polished the rough edges, minimized the terror, made it survivable in retrospect because that's what you do with trauma. You reshape it until you can live with it. Children absorb this code without being taught. They learned that the winter was something you mentioned proudly. We survived the long winter but never examined closely. It was a badge of honor and a wound you didn't touch. A defining experience and something you didn't talk about. Laura Ingalls learned how to tell the story the way De Smet wanted to hear it. The adventure version, the survival story, but inside she carried the other version. The one with fear and hunger and watching her mother's hands shake. The one that didn't fit the narrative but was somehow more true. It would take her 60 years to write down that version. To say, this is what it actually felt like, not heroic, not an adventure, just terrifying and exhausting and awful. And we survived anyway, not because we were special, but because we refused to give up. But in 1881, that story couldn't be told yet. It was too raw, too real. So the town developed its official version, the story they'd tell newcomers and children and historians, the story that said, "We faced hardship and conquered it. We're tough, we're resilient, we're survivors," and they were. All of that was true, but it wasn't complete, because surviving isn't the same as being unscathed. Resilience doesn't mean you weren't hurt. And the version of the story De Smet told itself left out all the parts that couldn't be polished. The fear, the breaking points. The moments where survival felt impossible and they kept going anyway because giving up wasn't an option even though it was tempting. So De Smet carried two stories, the one they told and the one they lived. And both were true, and neither was complete, and the space between them was where the real legacy of the Long Winter lived. The Long Winter ended in May 1881. But for the people who lived through it, the winter never really ended. They carried it with them forever, in their bodies, in their minds, in the lessons they taught their children and the preparations they made, and the fears they couldn't quite shake no matter how many summers passed. 20 years later, Carolyn Ingalls would still keep extra flour in the pantry, not because she needed it, not because trains weren't running, but because some part of her brain, the part that ground wheat for 4 hours a day for 7 months, couldn't fully accept that food would always be available. That scarcity wasn't the default state of existence, that she could relax because the crisis was over. That's what survival costs, not just the weight you lose or the sleep you miss during the crisis, but the hypervigilance that never quite turns off after. The inability to trust that things will be okay because you've seen how fast okay can turn into catastrophic. The way you flinch at the first snow, the way your stomach clenches when the wind picks up, the way every October for the rest of your life carries an edge of dread. And you pass it on, not intentionally. You don't sit your children down and say, "I'm going to teach you to be afraid," but they learn anyway. They learn from watching you check the pantry, from seeing you plant gardens twice as big as necessary, from feeling the tension in your shoulders when winter approaches, from the stories you tell and the ones you don't. Laura grew up understanding that safety was temporary, that stability was an illusion, that you could do everything right and still nearly die because weather doesn't care about your plans. That's a heavy lesson for a 13-year-old, the kind of lesson that shapes how you see the world for the rest of your life. She learned to be prepared, to save, to not trust that good times would last. And she passed those lessons to her daughter, Rose, who passed them to her readers, a chain of caution born from one winter in 1880 that echoed forward through generations. But here's the thing about trauma that gets passed down. It comes with strength too. Caroline Ingalls didn't just teach her daughters fear. She taught them that you can survive the unsurvivable, that your body can endure more than you think. That terror doesn't have to mean paralysis, that you can be afraid and do the work anyway. Laura learned what real strength looks like. Not heroic gestures, not dramatic moments, but the quiet, relentless persistence of waking up and doing the impossible thing again, of grinding wheat when your hands hurt, of baking bread when you're too tired to stand, of comforting children when you're terrified yourself, of holding your family together through sheer determination when logic says everything should fall apart. That's the gift wrapped inside the trauma. The knowledge that you're capable of more than you knew, that ordinary people contain extraordinary resilience, that survival isn't about being special, it's about refusing to quit. The mothers of De Smet taught their daughters this without words, through example, through the way they kept gardens too large and pantries too full and preparations too thorough, through the way they flinched at October snow but planted anyway, through the way they carried fear and strength in equal measure and showed their daughters that both were survivable. And those daughters, Laura and Mary and Carrie and all the others, grew up understanding something most people never learn, that you're stronger than you think, that comfort is temporary but strength is permanent, that the worst thing you can imagine surviving is survivable, that your mother can do impossible things, which means maybe you can too. That's not a small gift. That's the kind of inheritance that builds generations, the kind of knowledge that says, when your turn comes, when you face your own impossible winter, You'll have what it takes to survive it, because you come from people who did, because survival is in your blood, because strength is part of your inheritance. But it's complicated. Because alongside the strength is the fear, alongside the resilience is the trauma. You can't separate them. The winter that taught Caroline Ingalls she could survive anything also taught her that terrible things happen, and you can't always prevent them. The winter that proved De Smet could endure together also proved that suffering is real and painful, and sometimes unavoidable. So, what do you do with that? How do you carry both the trauma and the strength? How do you teach your children to be prepared without teaching them to be afraid? How do you honour what you survived without being defined by it? The women of De Smet didn't have answers. They just lived with the questions, planted gardens, raised children, kept pantries full, flinched at snow, told stories that minimised the fear, and quietly, privately, remembered what it actually felt like. The terror they'd never fully describe, the breaking points they'd never admit, the moments when they'd nearly given up but hadn't because there was no one else to keep going for their families. And in 1940, when Laura finally wrote it down, she gave voice to what all those women had carried silently. She said, "This is what survival cost. This is what we endured. This is what we never talked about, but always remembered. This is the weight we carried so our children could live." She wrote it for the women reading by lamplight during the Depression, the women grinding through their own impossible times, the women wondering if they were strong enough, and she said, "You are. You come from women who survived worse with less. You carry their strength in your bones. You can do this. It will hurt. It will cost you. But you can do it." That's the legacy of the long winter, not the wheat prices or the train schedules or the historical footnotes, but the knowledge that ordinary women survived the extraordinary, that mothers kept families alive through sheer determination. That strength isn't dramatic, it's daily, that you can carry trauma and strength simultaneously. That survival is possible even when it seems impossible, and that legacy doesn't belong to history, it belongs to you. Every woman facing her own winter, every mother trying to hold her world together, every daughter watching and learning what strength actually means. You carry what they carried, the fear and the strength, the scars and the resilience, the weight of what they survived, and the gift of knowing you can survive too. That's what De Smet gave the world. Not a story, a promise. That winter ends, that strength is real, that you can do hard things, and that you don't have to do them alone. You're watching this in 2026, more than 140 years after Caroline Ingalls ground wheat in a coffee mill, a century and a half after Daniel Loftus stood behind a counter rationing food to a starving town. So why does this story still matter? Why should you care about people who lived and died before your grandparents were born? Because their winter isn't really about 1880. It's about what happens when the systems you depend on fail, when the supply chain breaks, when what you thought was reliable turns out to be fragile, when you have to figure out how to survive with less than you need and no guarantee that help is coming. Sound familiar? You've lived through supply chain disruptions, empty grocery store shelves, uncertainty about whether things would get better or worse. Maybe you didn't face 7 months of blizzards, but you felt that same underlying fear. What if this doesn't get fixed? What if we have to figure this out on our own? What if the help we're expecting never comes? That's why the long winter still matters. Not because it was dramatic or historical or unique, but because it was human. And the questions those people faced are the same questions we face. How do you keep going when giving up would be easier? How do you take care of your family when resources are scarce? How do you maintain hope when logic says there's nothing to hope for? Caroline Ingalls teaches you something you need to know. You're stronger than you think. Not in the abstract motivational poster way, in the concrete, tested by reality way. She didn't know she could grind wheat for 4 hours a day for 7 months until she had to. She didn't know she could feed her family on almost nothing until almost nothing was all she had. She didn't know she could survive that level of fear and exhaustion until she survived it, and neither do you. You don't know what you're capable of until crisis forces you to find out. But here's what her story proves. Ordinary women doing ordinary work with extraordinary persistence can survive impossible situations. Not because they're special, because they refuse to quit. That's not just history, that's practical knowledge. That's what you need to remember when you face your own impossible winter, whatever form it takes. When you're overwhelmed by too much responsibility and not enough resources, when you're scared and exhausted and can't see a way forward, when you're grinding through the same difficult thing day after day with no end in sight, you're doing what Carolyn did, what every woman in De Smet did, what women have always done, the invisible work that keeps families fed and safe and functioning, the unglamorous persistence that doesn't make headlines but makes survival possible, the strength that looks like just getting through another day but is actually heroic. Modern life makes it easy to forget that strength. We celebrate dramatic moments, grand gestures, visible achievement, but the strength that actually matters, the strength that saves families and builds futures, is quiet, daily, persistent. It's the strength of showing up again tomorrow even though today was hard, of doing the work that needs doing even when no one notices, of holding your world together through sheer determination when everything says it should fall apart. That's what the women of De Smet teach you, and that lesson transcends time. Whether you're grinding wheat in 1881 or managing career and family in 2026, the fundamental truth is the same. You can do hard things. You can endure what feels unendurable. You can survive what seems unsurvivable. Not because you're exceptional, but because most women are capable of extraordinary things when their families need them to be. And here's the other lesson. You don't have to do it alone. De Smet survived because women supported each other, shared resources, ground wheat for neighbours who were too exhausted to grind it themselves, held each other up through the worst of it, created a network of care that made survival possible. That's still true. Your modern crisis, whatever it is more survivable with community, with women who understand what you're carrying because they're carrying similar weight, with support networks that don't wait to be asked, with the knowledge that you're not the only one fighting this battle. So when you watch this story about people who lived 140 years ago, don't think of it as history. Think of it as proof. Proof that women are stronger than they know. Proof that community matters more than individual heroism. Proof that survival is possible even when it seems impossible. Proof that your ordinary daily strength is actually extraordinary. Because you come from a long line of women who survived impossible things, who did the hard work, who held their worlds together, who discovered capacity they didn't know they had, and their strength runs in your blood. Their resilience is part of your inheritance. Their story is proof that you can handle whatever winter you're facing. That's why this matters. Not because it's historical, because it's true. Still true, always true, and you need to know it. You've been so focused on how they survived that you haven't asked the harder question. What happened after? Because surviving isn't the end of the story. It's barely the beginning. The real test comes after the crisis ends, when you have to figure out how to live with what you survived, how to move forward changed, how to rebuild when you're exhausted from just holding on. For the people of De Smet, May 1881 wasn't triumph. It was relief mixed with a new kind of fear. The fear of, what if it happens again? What if next winter is just as bad? What if we barely survived once and won't survive twice? Some families left, packed up and moved east or south or anywhere that wasn't the Dakota Prairie. They couldn't face another winter in the place that had nearly killed them. Couldn't rebuild in a town that reminded them daily of how close they'd come to dying. For them, survival meant escape, but most stayed, and staying was its own kind of courage. It meant looking at the place that had traumatized you and saying, I'm not going to let this destroy me. I'm going to plant deeper roots, build bigger cellars, prepare better, and when next winter comes, because winter always comes, I'll be ready. Daniel Loftus stayed, ran his store for 43 more years, never forgot the winter that nearly bankrupted him, but taught him what business could mean, never forgot that reputation and trust were more valuable than short-term profit, never forgot the weight of standing behind that counter, Knowing people's lives depended on his decisions, that weight changed him, made him more careful, more generous. More aware that merchants aren't separate from community, they're woven into it. His success after 1881 wasn't just about good business sense, it was about the loyalty of people who remembered, who chose his store because he'd chosen them when it mattered most. The Ingalls family stayed, proved up their homestead claim, built a house in town. Caroline planted gardens for decades after, always bigger than necessary, always with that edge of desperation that said, never again. Charles worked the land and played his fiddle and told stories that turned trauma into something manageable. And the girls grew up understanding that life was fragile and families were resilient and both things could be true at once. But here's what most people don't realise: survival was only the first crisis. What came next was almost harder. Between 1881 and 1885, De Smet faced challenges that survival hadn't prepared them for. The town that had nearly died suddenly had to figure out how to live, how to grow, how to transform from desperate survivors into functioning citizens. The population exploded. Homesteaders flooded in, drawn by railroad advertisements and cheap land and the promise of opportunity. The town that had been 30 families in 1880 was 300 families by 1883. Infrastructure that barely handled the original population collapsed under the new weight. Housing shortages, resource competition, tensions between old-timers who'd survived the winter and newcomers who hadn't. Social hierarchies shifted. The survivors carried status. They'd endured what the newcomers couldn't understand. But the newcomers brought capital and ambition and different ideas about what the town should become. Old loyalties met new economics. Community bonds stretched to accommodate strangers. The town that had been united by shared suffering fractured into competing visions of the future, and the debt came due. Merchants like Loftus, who'd survived by extending credit and selling at cost, suddenly had to collect. Farmers who'd borrowed against future harvests had to pay up. Families who'd made promises during the crisis had to keep them during recovery. The economic reality of survival crashed into the social bonds that had made survival possible. Some relationships broke. Marriages that had held through the winter collapsed under the stress of recovery. Business partnerships dissolved. Neighbours who'd shared everything during the crisis fought over boundaries and resources during the boom, because trauma bonds people together, but recovery can tear them apart. Different people heal differently, process trauma differently, move forward at different speeds. And then there were the children, the ones who'd lived through it, who'd learned fear and hunger and scarcity before they learned almost anything else, who'd watched their parents nearly break but not quite, who carried memories they couldn't fully process because they were too young to understand what had almost happened. Laura was one of them. At 13, she'd been old enough to witness everything but too young to control anything, and that experience shaped her entire life, made her careful, cautious, prepared. Made her want to write it all down so the lesson wouldn't be lost, so other people would know what survival actually looked like, what strength actually cost, what women were actually capable of. But in 1881, she was just a girl trying to understand what had happened, watching her town transform, watching survivors become strangers to themselves, watching the place that had nearly died figure out how to live. And that story, the recovery story, is almost more important than the survival story, because most of us don't die in our crises. We survive them, and then we have to figure out what to do with that survival, how to rebuild, how to move forward, how to become more than just people who didn't die. That's the story most people don't tell, but it's the one you might need more. Let's bring this home. Because you didn't watch 6 chapters about a winter in 1880 just for history. You watched because some part of you needed to know, can I survive what I'm afraid of? Am I strong enough for what's coming? Will I be okay if everything falls apart? And the answer, from Caroline Ingalls and Daniel Loftus and every person in De Smet during the long winter, is yes. But not in the way you think. You won't survive because you're special. You'll survive because you refuse to quit. Because you show up every day and do the work even when the work feels impossible. Because you grind the wheat and bake the bread and hold your family together through sheer determination. Because ordinary strength applied daily, accomplishes extraordinary things. You won't survive alone. You'll survive because other women hold you up. Because community means sharing the impossible burden. Because the women before you left blueprints for endurance, and the women around you are fighting similar battles, and the women after you will need to know it's possible. You won't survive unchanged. Crisis marks you, shapes you, teaches you things you didn't want to learn about fear and scarcity and human fragility. But it also teaches you about capacity and resilience and the surprising strength of ordinary people. You get to choose which lesson defines you. Here's what you need to remember from Carol and Ingalls. Strength isn't loud or dramatic. It's the coffee mill turning, the bread rising, the children fed, the work done, again and again and again. That's not weakness. That's not settling. That's the strength that actually saves lives. Here's what you need to remember from Daniel Loftus. Reputation matters more than profit. Trust is economic currency. The choice you make during crisis defines you more than any decision you make during prosperity. When you're tested, how you respond matters, not just for you, but for everyone watching. Here's what you need to remember from Laura. Bearing witness is a responsibility. Someone needs to remember what survival actually felt like. Not the polished story, not the heroic version, but the terrifying, exhausting, unglamorous truth. So the next person facing their impossible winter knows they're not the first, knows it's survivable because others survived it, knows that fear is normal and strength is possible and both can exist in the same moment. And here's what you need to remember about yourself. You're stronger than you know. Your daily work matters more than you realize. Your quiet persistence is heroism, even if no one calls it that. You carry the strength of all the women who survived impossible things. And when your winter comes, and everyone's winter eventually comes, you'll discover capacity you didn't know you had. Not because you're exceptional, because women are capable of extraordinary things when the people they love need them to be. Because survival isn't about being perfect or prepared or particularly brave. It's about refusing to give up, about doing one more day, about holding on when every reason to hope is gone except the stubborn insistence that you will not quit. That's what the long winter teaches. That's what matters across centuries. That's what you carry forward. But here's the thing. Survival is only the beginning. The story doesn't end when the train arrives and the supplies come and the crisis is over. The real story, the harder story, is what happens next. How do you rebuild after trauma? How do you move forward changed? How do you take a town that nearly died and help it learn to live? Between 1881 and 1885, De Smet faced challenges the winter hadn't prepared them for. The survivors had to figure out how to be more than survivors, how to grow from 30 families to 300, how to build infrastructure and social systems and economic foundations, how to welcome newcomers who hadn't earned the right to belong through shared suffering, how to transform desperation bonds into functional community. And it wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. Some people thrived and others broke. Some relationships deepened and others shattered. The town that had been united by crisis fractured into competing visions of the future. Old loyalties met new economics. Debt came due. Social hierarchies shifted. Children who'd survived trauma had to grow up carrying it. There were scandals, betrayals, business failures, families leaving, families staying and wishing they'd left. The messy, complicated reality of people trying to build normal lives after surviving the abnormal. Trying to move forward when part of them was still stuck in winter, grinding wheat, waiting for the train that might never come. That's the story that doesn't get told as often. The recovery story, the rebuilding story, the story of, we survived, now what? And it matters because most of us will face that question. Most crises don't kill us, they change us. And then we have to figure out how to live with the change, how to honour what we survived without being defined by it, how to use the strength we discovered without being consumed by the fear that taught us we had it. Daniel Loftus figured it out, turned survival into success, transformed crisis reputation into lasting trust, built a business that lasted decades because he'd proven himself when it mattered most. Caroline Ingalls figured it out, raised daughters who were stronger for watching her endurance, created a home that felt safe even though the world wasn't, carried trauma and strength simultaneously and showed her girls that both were survivable. Laura figured it out, spent 60 years processing what she'd witnessed, turned trauma into truth, gave voice to the women history forgot, created legacy from suffering, but DeSmet as a town, that's a longer, messier, more complicated story. A story about debt and growth and friction and transformation, about survivors becoming builders, about crisis bonds becoming something else, something harder to maintain but maybe more valuable, about the 4 years after the winter when the real test began. And that's a story for next time, because if you thought surviving the winter was hard, wait until you see what happened when they had to rebuild. When population exploded and resources stretched thin, and old hierarchies collapsed, and new tensions emerged. When the people who'd nearly died together had to figure out how to live together, that's when the real work began. That's the story history almost forgot. That's what I'll tell you next time. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.